George, you're obviously not a fan of the cranberries. You don't know Dolores O'Riordan, so that I thought she made my name famous, but that's okay. A little younger generation than you and me.
Fred, move out of the light there. It's kind of.
Oh, I should go to the podium.
Yeah,
Sorry about that. I do want to thank George, though, George and Pierre both, for giving EY the opportunity to work on this project. It's really been an interesting experience. There's a lot that we can do to help, and I'm looking forward to the second phase of our study. Rami and one of his colleagues, Sam, did all of the heavy lifting on this slide presentation that you see, and I know that there's a lot of detail. Too much really to absorb as you see it on the screen, but you'll have the slides afterward and you can digest them a little bit better. And some of you in the audience here have really given us a lot of help by sharing your data and going through different comments and different drafts of this slide deck that we put together. Our eyes can sort of glaze over with too many details, so what I really want to do is sort of elevate this to a more high level and just talk about the implications of what we found while waiting for a deeper dive and more analytical evidence to bring to bear on this, and look at it sort of strategically from the point of view of what needs to be done in order to help the industry. Rami has sort of set the stage. Clearly, most of you are losing money and this is not sustainable. And we've sort of identified what the industry has done for its part. So from first principles, on this slide, you can see in discussing this with government, I think we have to remind government why cannabis was legalized and what its objectives were in so doing. We've listed the three main objectives here on the slide, and the first two are really key, and that's to keep cannabis out of the hands of youth, meaning the illicit market, or as George calls it, the legacy market, to keep public health protection in mind by providing adult use cannabis that's regulated and we know that it's healthy, and finally keeping profits out of the hands of organized crime in that illegal market. And you can see from our score sheet, we feel the government and the industry have worked together and achieved these in part, but there's certainly a long way from being achieved. And the only way that they will is if there's collaboration between the industry and government. We've identified the reasons why this is a problem. It hinges largely on the contraband market and the inability to compete effectively, particularly on price, and that is driven by the large tax and regulatory fee wedge that you have to digest that the legacy market does not. You can see in the results that Rami presented as well, in areas where you are competitive on price, and we think of flower in particular, where the difference in price is fairly narrow, it's not sustainable. You're competitive on price only because you've decreased your margins to the extent that you're competing with the illegal market. The illegal market can continue to compete at that price level, and for all we know, compete at a much more effective price level. We simply don't have much ability to decide how much downward direction they can exert on price, and that's something that we want to determine as well through some additional analytical work. So change is required. The only way to really do it is by making representations and by collaboration, cooperation. And by that, we mean C3 and other industry stakeholders. And on the government side, you've really got sort of a variety of places to discuss this. We've had 3 MPs who, from their perspective, would persuade you to see local MPs and make representations to them and so on. And I don't disagree that that is an integral part of the strategy that you've got to adopt. But clearly, you in order to get real change, whether it's legislative or regulatory, you've got to be dealing with ministers and you've got to be dealing with key bureaucrats. And in this area, that's both on the health side and on the tax policy and administrative side. We've identified really 2 main pillars where you need assistance. One is on tax and the other is on regulation. And we move to the next slide, thank you. So to set the table, we've identified 11 possible options that governments could move on, and I'll talk a little bit about those. And I want to say my perspective on this, both on the tax and the regulatory pillar side, comes not so much, well, in part, I guess, from my current responsibilities at EY. I've been with EY since 2010 as the National Leader of Tax Policy. Before that, I was a senior bureaucrat here in Ottawa for 33 years. And for the last 20 years, I was a senior executive at the Canada Revenue Agency, responsible, well, at the end I was the Assistant Commissioner of Appeals, but earlier on in the 1990s, I was the Director General of Excise Duties and Taxes at the CRA, and I was also the Director General of the Excise Act Review Group, which did a legislative review of the old Excise Act that ultimately resulted in the current Excise Act 2001. That exercise took 6 years, by the way, which tells you how long some of these legislative change exercises can take. And at that time, of course, we only covered wine, beer, spirits, and tobacco products. Cannabis was a new entry, as you know, the last couple of years, and the Act is going to be used for vaping products as well very shortly. Just as an aside, because of the proposals for vaping products, this new excise duty framework under the same Excise Act 2001, and this covers all vapes except those that are infused with cannabis, which already are regulated under the Act. There were proposals in the 2021 budget that were modified in the 2022 budget. There's still lots of problems with the proposals that are on the table for that industry. So on a separate engagement, I've also written a fairly detailed report for a client, Imperial Tobacco, or ITCAN, Canadian subsidiary of BAT, because they are very much in the vaping industry. And I've written a commentary and recommendations concerning the legislative proposals for that framework, a number of which are quite portable to your situation, particularly the need for better coordination federally and provincially of excise duty rates, and also the stamping regime, and the fact that stamping is an enormous cost problem for the canopy industry. As you know, there was movement in the 2022 budget on that front, a promise of regulatory and legislative reform that would allow the movement of packaged but unstamped products from co-packers or contract manufacturers to licensed producers who would fulfill the stamping requirements. So that was a huge win, I think, for the industry, but there needs to be much more reform in that direction in order to reduce costs further. So with that little bit of personal background, that kind of sheds a light into some of the insights as I would see it in these 11 issues. The first one are the excise duty rates. And I think when cannabis was legalized at the early stages, I was fairly impressed with the way the federal and provincial governments did collaborate to establish a duty regime, a rate-in regime, in other words, a common base, and also a revenue sharing agreement, as you know. That there was a lot of back and forth before it was finalized, but that agreement for $1 a gram and then 10% ad valorem tax above $10 and a revenue split of 75% to the province and 25% to the federal government was very good start. The problem, I think, has been the evolution since then and the lack of movement on the part of government in response to the market forces that are there. And I say that it was a good start partly because of my experience in tobacco taxation, because some of you are not old enough to remember this as I do in the 1990s, but trust me, I was the DG of excise duties at the time, and in the 1990 budget, Michael Wilson increased excise duties on cigarettes by 3 cents a stick. And in short order, quite predictably, all of the provinces followed suit and they matched that rate increase. And why did they do that? They did that partly because they could, because you can justify rate increases on tobacco products by health objectives. Frankly, I'd be a little bit more cynical and say there were revenue objectives that were in top of mind on the part of both levels of government at that time. And I think what they didn't anticipate, and this is very relevant here, is the fact that contraband, this creates a profit incentive for people to move into the contraband market. There was contraband smuggling of tobacco products prior to 1990, but it was very small. It absolutely exploded after the federal and provincial budgets of 1990. And it occupied about 40 or 50% of the market, the total market, in Ontario and Quebec before 1994, when rates were reduced. And rates were only reduced for two, there were two preconditions. One was, it was a change of government at the federal level, so the Conservatives were replaced by the Liberals, and they didn't have the baggage of having to defend the initial decision that Michael Wilson made to increase the tax rates. And the second precondition was collaboration among the federal and provincial governments so that they could move in tandem, because it is a competitive market. They all want more of that pie, and the only way that you could move back was to do it at the same time. And that solved the problem. The problem disappeared in 2004, 2005. The contraband dried up. But ever since then, why? Because of progressive increases in those rates on tobacco, it's back, and it's a very serious problem at this point. And you're facing the same sorts of competitive prices, pressure prices with contraband market in your industry. So, long story short, on the first recommendation is to review those excise duties. And I'm not suggesting that would be easy to do politically. Rate reductions in taxes are rare. As I said, it happened in '94, but it took a crisis, practically, a political crisis, in order to force the government's hand to do that. But even looking at rates, there are different ways to slice and dice these rates. I mean, for example, the government makes a choice between specific or ad valorem taxes when they set these policies. They chose specific ones in this case, and were a combination of the two, a specific up to $10 and then an ad valorem over that level. Partly because they anticipated rates would probably prices would continue to rise. They didn't anticipate that there would be price reductions because of the compression in the competition. So that specific rate, which usually is your friend, because with time and inflation, unless they escalate it, which they've done in the Excise Act for products, as you guys know, unless they do that, then their share is actually going to be falling. But in a scenario where prices fall, their share is actually rising, and that's what we're seeing. It's because of the specific rate. Should it change to an ad valorem rate? I don't know. I mean, we're not making policy recommendations here. We're just setting the table, as I said. But that's one consideration. I know that there are proponents in the industry who feel that there should be a graduated rate structure depending on your output and so on, and that's another option. We're neutral on any of those sorts of options because some of them benefit parts of the industry and hurt others. But there are different ways to do it in addition to an absolute rate reduction. So I just throw that out. The second one I think is really key, the harmonization. And as I said, I've gone into more detail on this in the paper that I wrote for the vaping industry, for the vaping framework that's there, really advocating that not only when they talk to provinces, they not only agree on a common base, a common tax base, which they've done always, it's easy to do, but they agree on a common rate as well as the revenue split. And the reason is because if you have uniform taxes across the country, you still have a competitive issue with contraband, but you don't have an interprovincial arbitrage opportunity. And that's what happens as soon as they let provinces move in different directions. You see that across the board. You certainly see it in cannabis. You see it big time in tobacco products. If they move to a unified rate structure, a single tax wedge across the country, the advantage of that, as I say in this recommendation, is that then they can start considering moving to a single national excise stamp, instead of having all these specific color-coded provincial and territorial stamps. With the number of SKUs that you have in your industry and the requirement to predict in advance sales volumes by geographic location and so on, and then having to rework product and everything, it's really exacerbated by the stamping regime. And I would like to see that movement where they could simplify that. It is admittedly a lot harder when you've got existing taxes that are there, herding the cats provincially. I would pity the federal government doing that. It's easier at this point for the vaping framework because it's a clean sheet of ice. There's nothing there. If you're going to accept provinces to come in, do it on condition that they harmonize their rates, come up with a revenue split, whether it's 75-25, I don't care, something like that, where they can agree for as long a period of time as possible to keep peace and prevent this price competition and tax, and then you can adopt a single national stamp. Because all you really need is the ability, in terms of interdiction of product, to recognize stamped duty paid product from unstamped marked product. They don't need 13 different color-coded stamps in order to do that. Evidentiary proof is sufficient with a single stamp. And I won't get into the weeds with a lot of these because I'll just take up way too much time. But as you go down the list, you can see, you know, we've given some thought that you can develop further in discussions with government on the regulatory and on the tax side. On the tax side, again, you could be incentivizing certain products like the Cannabis 2.0 products, and your arguments there could turn on health advantages, harm reduction, as they put it in the vaping and the tobacco context. Harm reduction by moving away from combustible products to edibles or beverages or whatever. That's a consideration, especially important when you consider the price pressures are worse there than in the other segments of the market. If you look at edibles, I mean, it's not just tax, it's obviously potency as well, and we include potency in our list of policy recommendations here as well. There are a lot of restrictions that the industry has had placed on it, and they, I think, made sense from the point of initial legalization. The government was vulnerable and felt vulnerable in proposing this, and so they sort of stacked the decks to sort of dissipate public anxiety about what might happen with legalization. Those days are gone, as the other speakers have pointed out. They should be reviewing these to see whether they still are required. There is a tendency in government to over-regulate on things where risks are imprecise. In other words, policymakers as bureaucrats have a tendency, especially in the health side, to be overly conservative, and politicians are by nature risk averse. So the combination of those two factors at the political and the bureaucratic level is very problematic, and you've got to attack them and counter them at both levels, and the way to do that is with evidence, the kinds of evidence that we are trying to provide to you, and the kinds of evidence that David Coletto showed you in terms of public polling, which is very powerful at the political level. So some of these are really in the same sort of vein. I mentioned enforcement resources simply because I know from my tobacco experience that it does make a difference, and I don't get the sense, and I'm not an expert in this. It's very difficult because we're dealing with contraband market, which is extremely hard to measure and know the exact size and the nature of the contraband market. But my sense is that there's a lot more enforcement successes in tobacco products than there is in cannabis at this stage, and that's partly a question of the absolute resourcing, especially at the provincial level, and not just the federal level, and also the way in which they go about doing business. I can say, like, for example, in Quebec has been more successful on tobacco simply because they've done more novel things, like allowing local police forces powers of enforcement and allowing them to keep the proceeds of crime, to compensate them for whatever success they have. It incentivizes the police forces to do a more and better job. And then we close with these suggested public awareness campaigns. These are things that the industry can do, obviously, but if the government does them, people tend to have more trust and belief in government. I'm not saying that they don't trust you as an industry. I just mean that generally speaking. And they're financed out of public resources. The tax dollars that you guys are contributing and the regulatory fees that they're collecting could be well spent doing activities like this. You know, in other words, if they're going to take from you, give back something. My preference would be to reduce the regulatory fees as if you had that option, because I do find it quite unique, really, that when they legalized, they decided to impose this regulatory fee collection responsibility on your top line. I mean, that's I don't know of another industry where that's been done. It's not unusual or novel to see some cost recovery for certain things, but they're always done in relation to fees for service. You know, in this case, it's just we want you to pay for all of our regulatory activities, and it doesn't really give them much incentive to act efficiently in terms of the resources that they're allocated. And this is really on the health side. Not so much on the CRA side where I used to work. We didn't expect to get cost recovery for very many functions of the CRA. There's some, but that's almost non-existent. And I just close by, I think, agreeing with I think it was David who made another point about bringing to bear other perspectives inside government, particularly at the bureaucratic level. And I'm thinking of ISET in particular. In other words, the health prerogative, as I said, there is a tendency to over-regulate on the health side, not surprisingly because of their objectives and their vulnerability. To the extent that there are problems, even small problems, they will go in and regulate in a very aggressive way. And back to vaping products as an example of that, and not the cannabis-infused vapes, but those that aren't regulated yet, but will be as of October federally. What we saw a couple of years ago in the States were some very sad cases of open vaping systems that were contaminated, that were intentionally used to put other contaminants in the liquids, and there were health issues with that. The legal industry was immune from that. It was the users who were actually complaining, but it was the industry that ultimately bore the regulatory burden and still do. And it sort of goes to the point, I think, of getting your message clear and with evidence to the officials responsible on the health side, but also talking to people like ISEC, the old industry department, where their prerogative is to encourage economic development and growth. And really, you should be seeing that government objective equally considered with the health and the revenue ones. I think with that, I've rattled on a long time here. I better stop. And if we've got time, George, for